there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. There is only one being in the universe whose kingdom will have no end, and that is God himself. I've introduced the Bible's exilic literature as one of the most important blocks of literature in the Bible. In fact, there's more that comes out of the exilic period than any one period of the Bible. It's quite extraordinary. And this would have been such a confusing time for the Jews, who were, especially the faithful ones, the covenant-keeping ones, that they've done their best, and yet their neighbours, their friends, their family, and even those who were supposed to lead them, the priests and the princes and the kings and the prophets who were identified as prophets by the king, had not been faithful to the covenant of Yahweh. And so now the penalty described in the law of Moses has been enacted, that they are being exiled, just as the prophet Moses said would happen if they broke covenant with God and refused to be loyal to him. So what we have now is Daniel. As we've introduced him, we've seen he's a young man. He is a part of the original exiles, the original captives in Babylon. He's been put into the loyal public servant service of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and he is going to be there right up until Cyrus, as it tells us in the opening verses. And one of the things that we probably need to factor in, because as you read through Daniel, you're going to read, well, hang on, this is talking about Darius. Where's Cyrus? Where is Cyrus even mentioned? And this is where it becomes something that we now know, that Darius was like a title and Cyrus would have been something like a name. Interestingly, Isaiah 45 verse 1, it's believed that Cyrus was actually prophesied by the prophet Isaiah. This is, again, quite extraordinary. And as I would believe, the prophetic books of the Bible, I believe we have good reason to believe they actually are prophetic. In C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, he actually discusses Bible prophecy as one of the evidences of the miraculous. He lists John chapter 20 as an example of Christ telling the Apostle Peter, when you are old, this is how you will die. And he describes Peter's death. And C.S. Lewis makes the point that John is presenting this as prophecy, not as history, as prophecy. And C.S. Lewis says that means that the Gospel of John must have been written before Peter was killed, which was in AD 64. In the same sense, I have good reason to believe that the book of Daniel would have been written before the events he foretold. We're going to come up the home stretch now, and I'm going to give you a broad sweep of the remainder of the book of Daniel. There's a lot we can say about Daniel's details here, and I encourage you to dig in deeper yourself by perhaps looking at Joyce Baldwin's commentary in the IVP commentary series available from InterVarsity Press, and have a look at what she wrote back in the 1970s. You'll still be able to get this volume. It's called the Classic IVP series now of the Old Testament, because she points out the reasons why we have good reason to believe that the book of Daniel is authentic. In other words, what he is prophesying actually was prophecy. So let's consider for a moment what happens in the unfolding chapters after we left off in our previous session, which was King Nebuchadnezzar getting a vision of magnificently tall statue, which had a head of gold and a chest of silver and a midriff of bronze and legs of iron and then feet of iron and clay, with a unusual stone. Unusual because it comes from a mountain that did not originate at the effort of any man. And this stone, we understand, was Christ. And these kingdoms crumble when the Christ event happened. Now, what we're going to see also, if we had the time to read through the rest of this book, we would see that Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream. Now, bizarrely, after Daniel interpreted the dream of his statue, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that Daniel's God is the true God and that everyone should worship him. And yet, it seems, Nebuchadnezzar didn't. And so he has a dream of a tree, a great tree. And that great tree is to be chopped down. Interestingly, very interestingly, Nebuchadnezzar in his dream hears the decree to chop the tree down, and this was a metaphor of Judge Nebuchadnezzar, was decreed by the watchers. And again, if we had more time, we would look at how God had ordained certain heavenly creatures with delegated authority to judge the affairs of mankind, especially the leaders of nations. But we don't have time to delve into that. I mentioned in our previous section that the book of Daniel becomes interlaced with amazing supernatural activity. So we have this prophecy that Daniel sees and interprets the king's dream of this great tree and the tree being cut down, and Daniel tells him that this is you. This is you, and this is what happened. Nebuchadnezzar was off the throne for 7 years with a condition that caused him to wander the fields. And then his mind returned to him and he was restored, just as Daniel said would happen. Then what we have is, at this point, Nebuchadnezzar again acknowledges that the God of Israel was not just the God of Israel, he was the God of the whole earth, which is a profound revelation for anyone to get, by the way. And so then after that, we leave Nebuchadnezzar and we turn up in chapter 5 with a character by the name of Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar, Belshazzar. This is now the grandson, at least the grandson, possibly the great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he is having a feast, and he is being rather indifferent to the sacred things of Yahweh. He takes the gold vessels of the temple that were brought over when the Babylonians destroyed the temple, and he uses them as common drinking mugs. And this brings the judgment of God, as we read in chapter 5, that suddenly he sees a hand. This is almost like Adam's family thing. He sees a hand writing these words. This is taken from Daniel chapter 5 and verse 25. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter, says Daniel to him, because this Belshazzar is now called for Daniel, a much older man. And he says this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And I'm suggesting to you that Darius is also referred to in Ezra as Cyrus. So, with that in mind, we have this extraordinary episode, which we won't go into now, where there are people envious of Daniel, and they set him up, And the result is that Cyrus has ordered that all people must worship him and no one's to worship any other god. And the penalty if you break that is that you'll be thrown to the lions. Well, they set Daniel up. Of course he's not going to worship any other god apart from his God. And so he's thrown to the lions. And God protects him. And Darius sees it. And he realizes that he's been played by these people who are jealous and envious of Daniel. And so after Daniel comes out where the lions do nothing to him, he then puts Daniel's accusers in there with the lions, and they were breakfast. So what we have in chapter 7 is Daniel now receiving. This is where the Hebrew recommences, by the way. So now we're through with the historical section. We're through with what had happened. So the Aramaic now comes to an end. So here we have the Hebrew language recommencing, and we're going to see something, and it's a description of beasts, and it's metaphor, it's symbolic. It means a ruler. And this language of beast is now going to become the code for a ruler. If the beast is from the Eretz, Eretz, the land, he is a ruler who is Jewish or Hebrew. If the ruler is from across the sea, which means he's not from the promised land, he is a Gentile ruler. And so Daniel is seeing these various rulers. But what is increasingly going to happen as we move through to the end of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 12, I mentioned that there's an apocryphal additional chapters here which don't belong in the canon of Scripture. So we're not going to deal with those. But it becomes increasingly Christological, about Christ. So let me give you an example. This is taken from Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to read two verses, verse 13 and 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, the clouds of heaven. There came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So now we've got within the text itself the interpretation. In other words, we're told that this one who is to come will have a kingdom that will have no end. There is only one being in the universe whose kingdom will have no end, and that is God himself. Every human ruler, his kingdom comes to an end. But this king is described, this divine king is described as one like a son of man. In other words, he is human. So, when Jesus takes on the self-description as the Son of Man, he is building that claim on the language used here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Notice also, it says, I saw in my night visions, behold, with the clouds of heaven there came. Do you think there's clouds in heaven? Do you think they need a weather forecast each day? No. So it's telling us something. Clouds are associated with glory. The clouds of heaven, the glory of God. Heaven is often used as an interchange word for Yahweh himself. And so this one comes in the glory of God, and he's human. This is Christ. And what we're going to see is, if we back up at verse 9, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. This is the Father. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. If you read Revelation chapter 20, you will see this is echoing this part of the book of Daniel. If you read Revelation chapter 1, you will see this description is the description of Jesus Christ. I told you that the Ancient of Days is the Father. And you would say, well, Andrew, this was about the Ancient of Days, the Father. Yes, do you think his son has a family resemblance? Of course he does. He is the exact representation, Hebrews tells us in Hebrews chapter 1, about verse 3. He's the exact representation of the Father. And Daniel is seeing this around the late 500 BC. So we go through the book of Daniel. In these closing chapters, we see that in chapter 9, it describes much to his readers' I think disappointment, that he's reading from the prophet Jeremiah, and he notices that Jeremiah prophesied that the exile would last for 70 years. Then they would be free to go. And of course that happens with the decree of Cyrus, the decree of Darius. So we've already come to the end of chapter 6, where Darius is, again, he's introduced and he's described. And so we know also from the other literature in the Bible that it was Cyrus who issued the decree that all Jews who wanted to, they could return to Jerusalem. They could return to Judea if they wanted to. And not everyone did. And Daniel didn't. He remained in Babylon. But what we have is Daniel then saying, as he set his face toward Jerusalem and prayed that this would be the case, that the 70 years that they'd been in exile now would indeed be declared over. And it was. But then Daniel receives a word that really the exile from Jerusalem, which meant the exile from the temple where God's presence used to be, would last for 7 times 70 years. From the decree to rebuild the walls, which is what happened after Cyrus had given the decree that they could return, they began to rebuild the walls. We read that in Nehemiah. It was actually around about 490 or so years. I told you this, we're getting around 500 BC now. So we're at 490. It was 490 years, roughly, when Christ did appear. That would be the marking of when the Messiah would come. You see, the idea was that there would be a new temple built. And we'll see this in the Exilic literature. And that God would once again come and inhabit. And when we read in Malachi, and when we read in Ezra and so on, when they began to rebuild the temple, the presence of God did not manifest and come in. But the prophets said that it would. The Exilic prophets said that it would. And so when did the glory of God come back into the temple precinct? When Jesus came. In fact, Jesus just said this temple wouldn't actually be of bricks and mortar, it would be his body. And his body is the church. He does fill and inhabit and present himself in his temple, the church. We're going to continue to look through what the Bible has to say in the Exilic literature, and I hope you can join with me, and I hope this is illuminating for you as we begin to see what God is saying through this Exilic literature.